Welcome to another journey through the corridors of time, where tonight we'll explore an era that shaped the very foundations of our modern world, yet remains so utterly foreign to our contemporary experience that it might as well exist on another planet. As you settle into your comfortable bed, surrounded by the gentle hum of electricity and the soft glow of artificial light, allow yourself to drift backwards through the centuries, past the Industrial Revolution, beyond the Renaissance, into that vast stretch of human history we call the medieval period. This was a time spanning roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the dawn of the early modern world in the 15th, though tonight we'll focus primarily on what historians call the High Middle Ages, those centuries between 1000 and 1300 when medieval civilization reached its peculiar zenith. The world you're about to enter moved to rhythms entirely different from our own, governed not by clocks and schedules but by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of seasons, and the tolling of church bells that marked the canonical hours of prayer. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a medieval town on a misty morning, perhaps in England or France, sometime in the 13th century. The first thing that would strike you wouldn't be what you see, but what you smell, a complex tapestry of scents both familiar and alien, from the sweet aroma of baking bread mingling with the acrid smoke of wood fires, to the earthier notes of animal waste and unwashed human bodies living in close proximity. The sounds, too, would create a soundscape utterly unlike our modern world of engines and electronics. Instead, you'd hear the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wooden cartwheels on rutted roads, the lowing of cattle being driven to market, and always, always, the background chorus of human voices raised in conversation, argument, prayer, and song. This was a world where life expectancy hovered around 35 years, though this statistic masks a more complex reality. If you survived the perils of childhood, you might well live into your 60s or 70s. Still, death was a constant companion in ways we can barely comprehend today, stalking through villages in the form of famine, disease, warfare, and simple accidents that modern medicine would easily prevent. Tonight's exploration will take you deep into this world of contradictions, where extraordinary beauty coexisted with crushing poverty, where faith provided both comfort and terror, where knowledge was both preserved and suppressed. We'll walk through the daily struggles of those who worked the land, their lives bound to the soil in ways both literal and legal, experiencing the weight of feudal obligations and the constant specter of hunger that haunted even good years. You'll discover how medieval people understood their world through a lens of religious certainty mixed with folk wisdom, creating a worldview that was simultaneously sophisticated and superstitious. The medieval period often suffers from two opposing misconceptions in our modern imagination. On one hand, there's the romanticized vision of knights in shining armor, courtly love, and noble quests, a fantasy that owes more to Victorian reimagining than historical reality. On the other, there's the equally false notion of the Dark Ages, a time of unrelenting misery, ignorance, and barbarism. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in a world that was neither wholly dark nor particularly romantic, but rather deeply human in all its complexity. As we journey together through these 4 hours, we'll peel back the layers of time to reveal not just the grand sweep of historical events, but the intimate details of individual lives. You'll walk in the worn leather shoes of a peasant farmer, feeling the weight of the wooden plow as it cuts through heavy clay soil, understanding the precarious balance between survival and catastrophe that defined agricultural life. You'll witness one of history's greatest demographic disasters, the Black Death, not as a distant historical event, but through the eyes of those who lived through it, or more often, didn't. We'll explore the surprising sophistication of medieval knowledge, those techniques and understandings that we've only recently rediscovered, or that still elude our full comprehension. And finally, we'll ascend to the heights of medieval society, into the great halls of lords and ladies, where power and paranoia danced together in an elaborate ritual of politics and survival. Through it all, remember that these were real people, with hopes and fears, loves and losses, dreams and disappointments not so different from our own, even if the context of their lives seems almost impossibly remote. They laughed at jokes we might not understand, worried about problems we've long since solved, and solved problems we've long since forgotten we ever had. As you listen tonight, let the steady rhythm of medieval life wash over you like the turning of seasons they knew so well. There's something deeply soothing about contemplating the vast sweep of human history, understanding that our modern anxieties and concerns are but a brief moment in an enormous tapestry of human experience. The men and women of the Middle Ages faced challenges that would break many of us today, yet they persevered, adapted, and ultimately laid the groundwork for the world we inhabit. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and prepare to step through the veil of centuries into a world at once utterly foreign and remarkably familiar, where the fundamental struggles of human existence played out against a backdrop of castles and cathedrals, plagues and prayers, mud and majesty. Let us begin our journey into medieval times, starting with the foundation upon which this entire civilization rested, the daily labor and lives of the common people who made up 90% of the population. Bread, fleas, and backbreaking labor, a peasant's endless grind. The life of a medieval peasant began not with the gentle chirping of birds or the soft light of dawn, but in complete darkness, often hours before the sun would even think of cresting the horizon. In the depths of winter, this might mean rising at 4 or 5 in the morning, stumbling about in the pitch black, guided only by memory and the faint glow of banked embers in the hearth. There were no alarm clocks, of course, but the human body, when trained by years of routine, becomes its own timepiece, and generations of early rising had encoded this rhythm into the very bones of rural workers. The first sensation upon waking would likely be cold, a bone-deep, pervasive cold that settled into joints and extremities during the night, despite the proximity of family members and animals sharing the same space for warmth. Imagine yourself lying on a simple straw pallet, perhaps raised slightly off the beaten earth floor if you were fortunate enough to have a wooden frame, feeling the scratchy discomfort of rough woolen blankets that never quite seem to get clean. The air would be thick with the mingled sense of smoke from the perpetually smoldering fire, the earthy smell of the thatched roof overhead, and the unmistakable odor of animals, for in all but the most prosperous peasant households, the family's livestock shared the same structure, separated perhaps by a simple wooden partition or sometimes by nothing at all. This arrangement wasn't born of ignorance but of practical necessity. The body heat of cows, pigs, and chickens helped warm the space, and keeping animals close protected them from predators and thieves. As you rose from your pallet, your feet would touch the cold earth floor, packed hard by countless footsteps over the years, perhaps covered here and there with rushes or straw that needed constant replacing as they became soiled and decomposed. The first task of the day, even before breaking the night's fast, would be to revive the fire, coaxing the banked embers back to life with careful breath and small twigs, gradually building up to larger pieces of wood that would need to last throughout the day. The morning meal, if it could be called that, was a simple affair that would shock modern sensibilities with its monotony and meagerness. The staple food for the vast majority of medieval peasants was bread, but not the fluffy, white loaves we might imagine. This was dark, dense bread made from rye, barley, or at best, a mixture that might include some wheat, though pure wheat bread was a luxury reserved for the upper classes. The grain was often poorly stored, subject to damp and mold, and the resulting bread could be gritty with bits of millstone that gradually wore down teeth over a lifetime of consumption. A typical morning might see you gnawing on a heel of bread that was several days old, perhaps softened slightly by dipping it in ale. Yes, ale for breakfast, as it was often safer to drink than water, which could carry disease. The bread itself tells a story of the precarious nature of peasant existence. In good years, when the harvest was plentiful, a family might eat reasonably well, with bread supplemented by porridge or pottage, a thick soup of grains and whatever vegetables were available, sometimes with a bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. But good years were never guaranteed, and the specter of hunger was never far away. A single bad harvest due to too much rain, too little rain, an early frost, or any number of other agricultural disasters could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Peasants learned to recognize the signs of famine: bread, loaves stretched with ground acorns, chestnuts, or even sawdust in the most desperate times, anything to fill the belly and stave off the gnawing pain of hunger. With the morning meal concluded, such as it was, the real work of the day would begin, and this work was dictated entirely by the agricultural calendar that ruled medieval life with iron certainty. In spring, this meant plowing and planting, breaking up the heavy soil that had been compressed by winter's freeze and thaw cycles. Picture yourself behind a wooden plow, if you were fortunate enough to own one or share one with neighbors, pulled by an ox if you were prosperous, or by yourself and family members if you were not. The plow itself was a simple device by modern standards, little more than a wooden frame with an iron plowshare attached, but it represented one of the most valuable possessions a peasant family might own. The work of plowing was backbreaking in the most literal sense, hours spent bent over, guiding the plow through resistant soil, fighting rocks and roots, trying to create furrows straight enough to maximize the planted area. Every muscle in your body would ache by the end of a day's plowing, your hands blistered even through the calluses built up over years of such work, your back screaming in protest. Summer brought its own challenges and endless tasks. The growing crops required constant attention. Weeding was a never-ending battle, as aggressive wild plants competed with cultivated ones for precious nutrients and water. This was work often done by the entire family, including children as young as 5 or 6, who would spend hours bent double in the fields, pulling weeds by hand. There were no herbicides, no mechanical tools to ease this labor, just human hands and backs against the persistent force of nature. Between the weeding, there was the hay harvest, crucial for feeding animals through the winter, which had to be cut, turned, dried, and stored all within a narrow window of good weather. The sight of storm clouds gathering during haying time could mean disaster, as wet hay would rot, depriving livestock of winter feed. The main harvest in late summer and early autumn was the pivotal event of the agricultural year, a time of both exhausting labor and communal celebration if the harvest was good. Every available hand was needed, and the fields would be full of workers from dawn to dusk, cutting grain with sickles, backbreaking work that required bending to grasp each handful of stalks, cutting them close to the ground, then laying them carefully to dry. After cutting came threshing, beating the grain from the stalks with flails, then winnowing to separate the grain from the chaff, all of it physical labor that left workers coated in dust and plant debris, their lungs full of particles that would lead to respiratory problems later in life. But we must not imagine that peasants owned all the grain they harvested. The feudal system that structured medieval society meant that most peasants were serfs, tied to the land and owing various obligations to their lord. These obligations took many forms, but one of the most onerous was the requirement to work the lord's domain, his personal lands, for a certain number of days each week. This meant that during the crucial harvest time, peasants might spend 3 days a week harvesting their lord's grain before they could attend to their own, watching nervously as their own crops potentially overripened or were damaged by weather while they fulfilled their feudal duties. Beyond labor service, there were rents to be paid, often in the form of a portion of the harvest, and various fees and fines that could be levied for any number of infractions. The right to grind grain at the lord's mill, for instance, was a monopoly that required payment of a portion of the flour produced. The right to gather firewood from the forest, to graze animals on common land, to fish in streams, all of these came with obligations and restrictions that could be enforced with fines that might devastate a peasant family's fragile economy. The living conditions of medieval peasants would appall modern observers accustomed to even basic amenities. The typical peasant house was a single-room structure, perhaps with a loft for storage or sleeping, built of whatever materials were locally available. In England, this often meant a timber frame filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung plastered over a framework of woven branches. The roof would be thatched with straw or reeds, which provided decent insulation but required constant maintenance and harbored all manner of insects and rodents. There were few windows, and those that existed were small and covered with oiled cloth or thin pieces of horn, as glass was far too expensive for peasant dwellings. Inside this single room, all of life's activities took place. Cooking, eating, sleeping, working on indoor tasks during bad weather, and socializing all happened in the same space, often shared with valuable livestock. A typical evening might find a family of 6 or 7 people, plus perhaps a cow, a pig, and several chickens, all occupying a space no larger than a modern studio apartment. The lack of privacy was complete. Children would grow up witnessing every aspect of adult life, from birth to death, from the intimacies of marriage to the ravages of disease. The sounds of animals, the smell of their waste, the rustling of rodents in the thatch overhead, all of this was the constant backdrop to daily life. Hygiene, by modern standards, was virtually non-existent, though medieval people did make efforts at cleanliness within the constraints of their circumstances. Water had to be carried from wells or streams, often over considerable distances, making it a precious commodity not to be wasted on frequent bathing. Most peasants might bathe fully only a few times a year, though they would wash their hands and faces more regularly. Clothing was washed infrequently, as most peasants owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes at most, one for work, one for Sundays and festivals, and perhaps a spare. These garments, made of coarse wool or linen, would be worn day after day, becoming stiff with sweat and dirt, harboring lice and fleas that were simply accepted as an inevitable part of existence. The presence of parasites was so universal that it shaped daily routines and social interactions. Grooming sessions where family members would search each other's hair for lice were a regular occurrence, a strangely intimate ritual that we might find repulsive, but which medieval people accepted as normal as brushing teeth is to us. Fleas were everywhere, in bedding, clothing, and the rushes on the floor, their bites a constant irritation that everyone simply learned to live with. More serious parasitic infections were common too, with many people carrying intestinal worms that sapped their strength and contributed to malnutrition. Disease was a constant threat in the medieval peasants' world, made worse by poor nutrition, harsh working conditions, and lack of medical knowledge. A simple cut could become infected and lead to death, as there were no antibiotics. A broken bone might heal crooked, leaving someone partially disabled for life, unable to perform the physical labor necessary for survival. Childhood diseases that we now prevent with vaccines regularly swept through communities, carrying off the young and weak. Women faced the particular danger of childbirth, with perhaps 1 in 3 women dying from complications of pregnancy or delivery over the course of their reproductive years. The diet of medieval peasants, while monotonous, was carefully managed to extract maximum nutrition from available resources. Besides bread, the diet consisted primarily of pottage, that constantly simmering pot of grains and vegetables that was the hot meal of the day. Cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, and beans were the most common vegetables, preserved through various methods for winter consumption. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasants, perhaps enjoyed a few times a year at major festivals. More common was bacon or salt pork from the family pig, if they were fortunate enough to own one, carefully rationed throughout the year. Eggs from chickens provided crucial protein, though these too might need to be sold or given as rent rather than consumed. The preservation of food for winter was a crucial skill that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Without refrigeration, medieval peasants relied on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to preserve food. Vegetables were stored in root cellars or preserved in salt or vinegar. Grain had to be carefully stored to prevent spoilage from moisture and protected from the constant threat of rats and mice. The loss of stored grain to rodents or mold could spell disaster for a family, turning what seemed like an adequate harvest into a winter of hunger. The agricultural year was punctuated by religious festivals that provided the only respite from constant labor. These feast days, dedicated to various saints or marking important points in the Christian calendar, were eagerly anticipated breaks when work was forbidden and communities came together for celebration. Yet even these celebrations were modest by modern standards. Perhaps some extra food, ale flowing more freely than usual, dancing to simple musical instruments, and games that seem crude to modern sensibilities but provided crucial psychological relief from the grinding nature of daily existence. Community was essential to survival in the medieval peasant world. No single family could be entirely self-sufficient, and elaborate systems of mutual aid and obligation bound villagers together. Harvest time required communal effort, with families helping each other bring in crops. Building or repairing a house was a community project, with neighbors providing labor in exchange for the promise of similar help when needed. This interdependence created tight-knit communities, but also meant that privacy was virtually unknown and social pressure to conform was intense. The concept of childhood as we understand it didn't exist in the medieval peasant world. Children were economic assets who began contributing to the family's survival as soon as they were physically able. By age 5 or 6, children would be given simple tasks like gathering eggs, feeding chickens, or scaring birds from planted fields. By 10 or 12, they would be doing adult work, boys following their fathers to the fields, girls helping their mothers with domestic tasks and garden work. Education, in the formal sense, was virtually non-existent for peasant children. Literacy was rare, and most knowledge was practical, passed down orally from generation to generation. Marriage for peasants was as much an economic arrangement as a romantic one. A man needed a wife to manage the domestic economy, tend the garden, care for small animals, and produce children who would contribute labor. A woman needed a husband for protection and economic support in a world that offered few options for single women. Love might develop over time, but the initial decision to marry was often based on practical considerations. Did the potential spouse come from a reliable family? Did they have a good reputation for hard work? Could they bring any resources to the marriage? As evening approached in the medieval peasant household, the day's labor would finally wind down. The evening meal, usually eaten as darkness fell, would be another simple affair, more bread, perhaps some cheese if available, the ever-present pottage, and ale or water to drink. The family would gather around the fire, the only source of light as darkness enveloped the world outside. This was the time for storytelling, for passing down family history and folk wisdom, for singing the old songs that connected them to generations past. The flickering firelight would cast dancing shadows on the walls as voices rose and fell in the ancient rhythms of oral tradition. But these evening gatherings were brief, for candles were expensive and firewood needed to be conserved. Soon after full darkness fell, perhaps by 8 or 9 o'clock, the family would prepare for sleep. The fire would be carefully banked to preserve embers for the morning, the animals would be checked one last time, and everyone would settle onto their pallets for the night. Sleep came easily to bodies exhausted by physical labor, but it was often interrupted. The sounds of animals moving about, the need to tend the fire if the night was particularly cold, the crying of babies, or the coughing of sick family members would punctuate the darkness. In summer, fleas and other insects made sleep fitful, while in winter, the cold might require the entire family to huddle together for warmth. And then, before the body had fully recovered, before the aches of yesterday's labor had faded, the cycle would begin again. Another day of backbreaking work, of constant struggle against nature and circumstance, of small victories and frequent setbacks. This was the reality for 90% of the medieval population, a life so removed from our modern experience that it requires real effort of imagination to comprehend its hardships and occasional simple pleasures. The peasants of medieval Europe were the foundation upon which the entire edifice of medieval civilization rested. Their labor fed the nobles who ruled, the clergy who prayed, and the merchants and craftsmen of the towns. Yet they lived always on the edge of disaster, one bad harvest away from famine, one illness away from death, one war away from complete devastation. Still, we must not see them simply as victims. Within the constraints of their harsh world, medieval peasants created rich cultures, maintained complex social networks, and found moments of joy and meaning. They sang and danced, fell in love and raised families, told stories and celebrated victories, however small. They developed sophisticated agricultural techniques suited to their local environments, created communities of mutual support that allowed survival in the face of overwhelming challenges, and maintained oral traditions that preserved knowledge and culture across generations. As we prepare to move from the fields and hovels of the peasantry to one of the most catastrophic events in human history, remember that these ordinary people, whose names history has largely forgotten, were the true heroes of the medieval world. Their endurance, their perseverance, and their simple human courage in the face of unimaginable hardship created the foundation for all that would come after. The story of medieval peasant life is not just a tale of suffering and oppression, though there was plenty of both. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to our capacity to find meaning and community even in the harshest circumstances, and to the quiet dignity of those who labor in obscurity to sustain the world. Yet there remain aspects of the peasant experience we have not fully explored, dimensions of their daily existence that shaped their worldview in profound ways. The church, for instance, was not merely a building in the center of the village, but the axis around which all of life revolved. The tolling of church bells marked the hours of the day in an age before clocks were common, calling the faithful to prayer at regular intervals, creating a rhythm that structured time itself. For peasants, the church represented both comfort and obligation, salvation and expense. They were required to pay tithes, 1/10 of their produce, to support the clergy, another burden on top of rents and feudal obligations. Yet the church also provided the only explanation for their suffering that made sense in their world, promising rewards in the afterlife for those who endured hardship with patience and faith. Sunday Mass was obligatory, and absence without good reason could result in fines or public penance. Picture yourself standing for hours in a cold stone church, as peasants did not sit during services, listening to Latin words you couldn't understand, watching the mysterious rituals of the priest, breathing in the smoke of incense that provided a rare sensory pleasure in a world of harsh smells. The church calendar provided the structure of the year, with its cycle of fasts and feasts, saints' days, and holy obligations. Lent meant 40 days of even more restricted diet than usual, avoiding meat and sometimes dairy, subsisting on fish if available, or just vegetables and grain. But it also meant the anticipation of Easter celebrations, one of the few times in the year when even poor families might enjoy eggs and fresh meat. Winter deserves special consideration in our understanding of peasant life, for it was a season of particular hardship that tested the limits of human endurance. As the days grew shorter and colder, the work changed but never ceased. Animals still needed feeding, water had to be broken through ice and carried, firewood had to be gathered and split. The cold was an enemy that invaded every aspect of life. Fingers would grow numb and clumsy, making even simple tasks difficult. Chilblains, painful inflammations caused by exposure to cold and damp, were a constant winter complaint, making every movement agony. The single-room houses, drafty and poorly insulated, were barely warmer than the outside, and families would cluster around the fire, rotating positions to warm different parts of their bodies. Food stored from the harvest had to be carefully rationed to last until spring, a complex calculation that required estimating not just human needs but animal feed as well. By late winter, stores would be running low, and the diet would become even more monotonous, perhaps just bread and thin gruel, day after day, as vegetables ran out and preserved meat was exhausted. This was the infamous hunger gap of late winter and early spring, when last year's food was nearly gone but new crops were not yet ready. It was during these months that the weak died, the elderly, the very young, those whose bodies couldn't withstand the combined assault of cold and malnutrition. The legal status of medieval peasants added another layer of hardship to their already difficult lives. Most were not free in any sense we would recognize today. Serfs were tied to the land, unable to leave without their lord's permission, unable to marry without paying a fee, subject to the jurisdiction of the manor court rather than royal justice. The manor court, presided over by the lord or his representative, dealt with all manner of disputes and infractions. A peasant might be fined for allowing his animals to stray into the lord's fields, for gathering wood without permission, for brewing ale without license, for grinding grain at a mill other than the lord's. These fines, recorded in court rolls that provide us with glimpses into peasant life, could be devastating. The loss of a few pennies in fines might mean the difference between having seed for next year's planting or going hungry. The system was designed to extract maximum value from the peasantry while keeping them just above the level of complete destitution. Death, when it came to the medieval peasant household, was a familiar visitor, not hidden away in hospitals or funeral homes, but occurring in the same room where all of life's other activities took place. Children would watch their grandparents slowly fade, would see the mysterious transformation death brought, would help wash and prepare the body for burial. The rituals surrounding death were among the few occasions when peasants might spend scarce resources on something beyond mere survival. Even poor families would try to provide candles to burn around the body, would pay for masses to be said for the soul's journey through purgatory, would share food and ale with neighbors who came to the wake. Old age, for those fortunate enough to achieve it, brought its own challenges in a world without retirement or social safety nets. Elderly peasants who could no longer perform hard physical labor relied entirely on their children for support, creating multi-generational households where resources were stretched even thinner. Those without children or whose children had died faced destitution, perhaps surviving on charity from the church or neighbors, or simply dying alone and unmourned when they could no longer work. The psychological landscape of medieval peasant life is perhaps the hardest for us to truly comprehend. These were people who lived with a level of uncertainty we can barely imagine, where a single hailstorm could destroy a year's work in minutes, where armies might appear without warning to devastate entire regions, where disease could strike down the healthy in days. Yet they developed coping mechanisms, ways of understanding and accepting their fate that allowed them to continue. Fatalism was common, the belief that gods will determine all outcomes, that suffering in this life was a test or punishment that would be rewarded in the next. But there was also a fierce attachment to small pleasures and brief moments of joy. A successful harvest, a healthy baby, a daughter's wedding, a son returning safe from war, these occasions were celebrated with an intensity born from the knowledge of how rare and precious such moments were. The mental landscape of peasants was populated with beliefs that blended Christian doctrine with far older folk traditions. They lived in a world where the forest was full of dangers both natural and supernatural, where wise women knew herbs that could heal or harm, where the changing of seasons was marked by rituals that the church tried to suppress but never quite eliminated. Every village had its stories of ghosts and spirits, of cursed fields and blessed wells, of times when the normal rules of the world seemed suspended. These beliefs weren't mere superstition, but attempts to make sense of a world where so much seemed arbitrary and cruel. As we prepare to leave the world of the medieval peasant behind and move to the catastrophic events that would reshape European society forever, we should pause to consider what their lives mean for our understanding of human nature and social organization. These were people who lived under conditions that would break most modern individuals within days, yet they not only survived but created cultures, communities, and traditions that endured for centuries. Their story reminds us that human beings are capable of adapting to almost any circumstances, of finding meaning and purpose even in the midst of grinding poverty and oppression. It also serves as a sobering reminder of how recent and fragile our modern comforts truly are, how quickly circumstances can change, how thin the line between prosperity and disaster has been for most of human history. The medieval peasants we've spent this time with were not so different from us in their fundamental humanity. They loved their children, worried about the future, found joy in small victories, and faced their hardships with whatever courage they could muster. Their lives, though separated from ours by centuries and vast differences in circumstances, speak to universal human experiences of struggle, endurance, and hope. As we turn now to one of history's greatest catastrophes, remember that it was these ordinary people, these forgotten millions, who bore the brunt of the disaster that was about to unfold across Europe. The Black Death would test the resilience of medieval society to its absolute limits, and it would be the peasants, as always, who would pay the highest price. The Black Death, when Europe lost a third of its soul. In the year 1347, as autumn turned to winter along the bustling trade routes of the Mediterranean, death arrived in Europe aboard merchant ships in a form so devastating that survivors would struggle to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. The ships that docked in Messina, Sicily, that October carried more than the usual cargo of spices, silks, and grain from the east. They carried infected rats and fleas harboring Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would soon transform the continent in ways no one could have imagined. The Genoese sailors who stumbled off these vessels were already dying or dead, their bodies bearing the mysterious black swellings that would give this pandemic its enduring name. The speed at which the plague spread defied medieval understanding of disease transmission, seeming to leap from port to port, city to city, with a malevolent intelligence that convinced many they were witnessing God's final judgment upon a sinful world. Picture yourself standing in one of these port cities in late 1347, perhaps a merchant or dock worker going about your daily business, unaware that the world as you know it is about to end. The first signs would be subtle. Perhaps you'd notice that some of the sailors from recently arrived ships seemed unwell, moving slowly, their faces flushed with fever. Within days, however, the situation would transform from concerning to catastrophic as the disease spread through the crowded quarters near the harbor, then into the city proper, then out along every road and pathway into the countryside beyond. The plague manifested in 3 forms, each terrible in its own way, though medieval observers didn't make these clinical distinctions we understand today. The bubonic form, the most common, announced itself with sudden fever and the appearance of painful swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck, the infamous buboes that gave the disease its primary name. These swellings, ranging from the size of an egg to that of an apple, turned black as blood pooled beneath the skin, creating a horrifying transformation of the human form that terrified observers as much as the disease itself. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough blood and spread the infection through the air with each labored breath, while the septicemic form poisoned the blood so quickly that victims might die within hours of first feeling ill, their skin turning purple-black as their circulatory system failed. Medieval physicians, working within the framework of humoral theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine, were completely unprepared for a disease of this magnitude and virulence. They prescribed bleeding to balance the humors, aromatic herbs to purify the air, and complex compounds of ingredients like crushed emeralds for those who could afford them, all equally useless against the bacterial infection ravaging their patients' bodies. Some doctors wore distinctive costumes that have become iconic: long leather robes, gloves, and beaked masks filled with aromatic substances, believing that bad air or miasma was the cause of transmission. The social fabric of medieval society began to unravel with shocking speed as the death toll mounted. The disease didn't respect social hierarchies. Nobles and peasants, clergy and merchants, adults and children all fell before its advance, though the poor, living in more crowded and unsanitary conditions, suffered disproportionately. Imagine the transformation of a typical medieval town as the plague took hold. The normal bustle of market days would cease as people became afraid to gather in groups. The rhythmic hammering from blacksmith shops would fall silent as craftsmen died or fled. Churches that once echoed with prayers would become morgues, their floors covered with bodies awaiting burial that might never come, as even gravediggers succumbed to disease. The speed of death was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the plague. In an era when people expected to have time to prepare for death, to receive last rites, to say farewell to loved ones, the plague compressed what should have been days or weeks into mere hours. A person might wake healthy, develop symptoms by noon, and be dead by sunset, denying them and their families the rituals and preparations that made death bearable in medieval society. Chroniclers of the time struggled to convey the scale of mortality they witnessed. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, described how the sick were abandoned by family members too terrified to provide care, how bodies were left in the streets because there was no one left to bury them, how mass graves were dug and bodies thrown in like layers of cheese on lasagna until they were full. In London, which the plague reached in the autumn of 1348, the situation became so desperate that new cemeteries had to be hastily consecrated to handle the dead. The Bishop of London purchased a piece of land called East Smithfield, which became an enormous burial ground where bodies were interred in long trenches, packed closely together in a way that violated every norm of Christian burial. Archaeological excavations of these plague cemeteries have revealed the desperation of the time: bodies buried hastily, sometimes 5 or 6 deep, without the usual care for orientation or individual grave goods, testament to a society overwhelmed by the sheer scale of death. The psychological impact on survivors is difficult for us to fully comprehend. Imagine losing not just one family member, but perhaps your entire family within the span of a week. Parents buried children, children were orphaned, entire bloodlines were extinguished. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote from Siena, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so did many others likewise." The normal social bonds that held communities together began to fracture under the strain. Stories emerged of parents abandoning sick children, spouses fleeing from infected partners, priests refusing to administer last rites for fear of infection. While these accounts may have been exaggerated by traumatized chroniclers, they speak to a fundamental breakdown of the social order that had defined medieval life. Yet alongside stories of abandonment and cowardice, there were also accounts of extraordinary courage and compassion. Some priests continued their duties even as their colleagues fled, providing spiritual comfort to the dying at the cost of their own lives. Groups of citizens organized to ensure that the dead received at least minimal burial rites, that orphans were cared for, that some semblance of order was maintained. As the plague spread across Europe, different regions responded in different ways, creating a patchwork of human reactions to catastrophe. In some German towns, the Jewish population was blamed for the plague, accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrible pogroms that destroyed entire communities even before the plague could. These massacres represent one of the darkest aspects of the plague years, showing how catastrophe can bring out the worst in human nature, turning fear into murderous hatred. In other places, the response took the form of extreme religious devotion. Groups of flagellants appeared, traveling from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance meant to appease God's wrath. These processions, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, would arrive in a town square, form circles, and begin their ritual of self-punishment. Picture the scene. Men and some women, stripped to the waist, striking themselves with leather whips embedded with metal spikes, their backs running with blood, chanting prayers and songs of repentance. They believed that by taking suffering upon themselves, they could convince God to lift the plague from the land. The movement spread rapidly across Germany, the Low Countries, and into France, creating a kind of religious hysteria that church authorities watched with growing alarm. The flagellants operated outside the normal church hierarchy, claiming direct divine inspiration, and their movement began to take on revolutionary overtones, challenging both religious and secular authority. Eventually, Pope Clement VI condemned the movement, ordering secular authorities to suppress it, but not before it had spread across much of northern Europe, leaving a trail of blood and religious fervor in its wake. The Church itself faced an existential crisis during the plague years. If this was God's judgment, what did it mean that the clergy were dying at the same rate as everyone else? Why weren't prayers and religious processions stopping the disease? Some priests fled their posts, abandoning their flocks, while others stayed and died at rates that may have exceeded the general population due to their exposure to the sick and dying. The death of so many clergy created practical problems as well. Who would perform marriages, baptisms, and burials? Who would say Mass and hear confessions? The Church was forced to rapidly ordain new priests, sometimes with minimal training, leading to a decline in the educational level of the clergy that would have long-lasting consequences. Economic life ground to a halt in many regions as the plague spread. Fields went unharvested as farmers died or fled. Livestock wandered untended, reverting to wild states or dying of neglect. Trade routes that had connected Europe for centuries fell silent as merchants refused to travel to infected areas. The complex web of commerce that had been building since the High Middle Ages began to unravel. In towns and cities, workshops stood empty as master craftsmen and their apprentices succumbed to disease. The guild system, which had regulated production and maintained quality standards, broke down as there simply weren't enough skilled workers left to maintain traditional practices. Knowledge that had been passed down through generations was lost as entire families of specialists died within days of each other. Some of the most vivid accounts of the plague come from those who witnessed its impact on rural areas. The English chronicler Henry Knighton wrote of villages where the entire population died, leaving houses empty, villages deserted, and fields untilled. Travelers reported finding villages where doors stood open, meals sat half-eaten on tables, and not a living soul remained to explain what had happened. The demographic catastrophe was staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died during the initial outbreak of 1347 to 1353, with some regions experiencing even higher mortality rates. Florence lost perhaps 3/4 of its population. England's population fell from around 5 million to 2.5 million. Entire regions of France and Germany were depopulated. But numbers alone cannot convey the human reality of this catastrophe. Each death represented not just a statistical loss but the end of a unique human story, the breaking of family bonds, the loss of accumulated knowledge and skill. Children grew up without learning their parents' crafts. Farms reverted to wilderness for lack of farmers. Books went uncopied as scribes died, taking their literacy with them. As the initial wave of plague began to subside in the early 1350s, survivors faced a transformed world. The massive mortality had created unprecedented social mobility. Peasants who survived found that their labor was suddenly valuable in a way it had never been before. With so many dead, there weren't enough workers to tend the fields, and lords who had previously been able to dictate terms now had to negotiate. Wages rose dramatically as workers demanded compensation that reflected their scarcity. In England, agricultural workers' wages doubled or tripled in some regions. Attempts by authorities to freeze wages at pre-plague levels through legislation like the English Statute of Labourers of 1351 largely failed, as economic reality overwhelmed legal decrees. The traditional bonds of serfdom began to loosen as peasants simply left estates where conditions were poor, knowing they could find better situations elsewhere. Lords who tried to enforce traditional obligations found their estates deserted. The balance of power between nobility and commons had shifted in fundamental ways that would contribute to peasant uprisings in the following decades. Urban areas saw similar transformations. Guilds that had previously restricted membership now actively recruited new members to replace deceased craftsmen. Social mobility that would have been impossible before the plague became common as survivors inherited property and positions from deceased relatives or simply occupied abandoned homes and workshops. Women, in particular, found new opportunities in the post-plague world. With so many men dead, widows inherited businesses and property, running workshops and trading enterprises that would have been closed to them before. While these gains would be gradually rolled back in subsequent generations, for a brief period, the social constraints of gender loosened under the pressure of demographic necessity. The psychological impact of surviving the plague left deep scars on European consciousness. Art and literature produced in the decades following the Black Death reflected a new preoccupation with mortality. The dance of death became a common artistic motif, showing death as a great equalizer, leading pope and peasant, merchant and monk in the same macabre dance. Religious expression changed as well. The confident scholasticism of the High Middle Ages gave way to more personal, emotional forms of devotion. Mysticism flourished as people sought direct connection with the divine, having seen the institutional church prove powerless against the plague. New religious movements emphasized personal piety over ceremonial observance, laying groundwork for the religious reforms that would culminate in the Protestant Reformation. The plague didn't disappear after the initial catastrophe of 1347 to 1353. It returned again and again, roughly once per generation, for centuries. These subsequent outbreaks, while never reaching the mortality levels of the first wave, served as constant reminders of human vulnerability. The plague of 1361 to 1362, known as the Children's Plague, because it particularly affected those born since the first outbreak, killed perhaps 10 to 20% of the population. Each return of the plague renewed social tensions and economic disruptions. Cities developed plague regulations, including quarantine measures that kept ships suspected of carrying disease waiting for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, giving us the word quarantine before allowing them to dock. Pest houses were established to isolate the sick, and civic authorities developed protocols for dealing with infected households. The medical understanding of plague gradually evolved, though true comprehension of disease transmission wouldn't come for centuries. Physicians developed elaborate theories about planetary alignments, corrupted air, and imbalanced humors. They prescribed preventive measures that ranged from the useless, carrying aromatic pomanders, to the accidentally effective, avoiding crowds and infected individuals. Some communities developed surprisingly sophisticated public health measures. The Italian city-states led the way in developing systems of health boards with the power to impose quarantines, restrict movement, and mandate the cleaning of streets and the removal of waste. While they didn't understand the true cause of plague transmission, their empirical observations led to practices that likely saved lives. The transformation of European society following the Black Death was profound and lasting. The demographic catastrophe had broken the economic and social patterns that had defined the High Middle Ages. The labor shortage gave common people leverage they had never possessed before. The psychological trauma created a more individualistic, questioning culture less willing to accept traditional authorities. In many ways, the plague marked the beginning of the end of the medieval world order. The confidence in established institutions, church, nobility, traditional learning had been shaken beyond repair. The seeds of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the modern world were planted in the devastated soil of post-plague Europe. Yet we should be careful not to see the Black Death simply as a catalyst for positive change. The immediate experience was one of unimaginable horror and loss. Entire civilizations' worth of accumulated knowledge disappeared. Artistic traditions were broken. Languages and dialects vanished as their speakers died. The cultural continuity that connected medieval Europe to its classical past was severed in many places. The survivors of the Black Death lived in a world haunted by absence, empty houses, abandoned villages, silent workshops where the sound of labor had once filled the air. They had witnessed the complete breakdown of the social order they had believed was divinely ordained. They had seen death on a scale that challenged every assumption about God's plan for humanity. As we prepare to move from this tale of catastrophe and transformation to explore the sophisticated knowledge that medieval people possessed despite their technological limitations, we should pause to consider what the Black Death reveals about human nature and social resilience. This was humanity tested to its absolute limits, facing an enemy it couldn't see or understand, armed with nothing but courage, faith, and the simple determination to survive. The fact that European civilization not only survived, but eventually emerged transformed and in some ways strengthened from this catastrophe speaks to the remarkable adaptability of human societies. The plague forced innovations in public health, labor relations, and social organization that would shape the modern world. It demonstrated that even the most rigid social hierarchies could be overturned by circumstances, that human ingenuity could find ways forward even in the darkest times. The Black Death remains one of history's great turning points, a moment when the trajectory of human civilization was fundamentally altered. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was different in almost every measurable way from the one that had existed before. The confident, hierarchical, deeply religious world of the High Middle Ages had been replaced by something more complex, more questioning, more recognizable to modern eyes. The survivors carried forward hard-won lessons about disease management, social organization, and the fragility of human life. They rebuilt their world with the knowledge that everything they created could be swept away by forces beyond their control or understanding. This awareness created a creative tension that would drive European civilization toward new achievements in art, science, and exploration. As we turn now to examine the sophisticated knowledge and practices that medieval people developed, remember that many of these innovations were responses to the challenges revealed by the plague. The catastrophe had shown the limitations of traditional knowledge, spurring new investigations into the natural world, new approaches to social organization, and new ways of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. The economic reverberations of the plague continued for generations, reshaping not just wage structures but the very nature of European commerce and agriculture. In the countryside, the massive mortality had left vast tracts of agricultural land abandoned, slowly returning to forest and wilderness. Entire villages simply ceased to exist, their locations marked only by the ruins of churches and the ridge and furrow patterns in fields that would remain visible for centuries. This abandonment of marginal agricultural land actually improved the situation for many survivors. The land that remained under cultivation was generally the most fertile and productive, leading to better yields per acre and improved nutrition for those who remained. The desperate cultivation of poor soils that had characterized the overpopulated decades before the plague was no longer necessary. The wool trade, which had been one of medieval Europe's most important industries, underwent fundamental transformation. In England, with fewer agricultural workers available, many landowners converted their estates from labor-intensive grain production to sheep farming, which required far fewer workers. Entire villages were cleared to make way for sheep pastures, a process that would continue for centuries and reshape the English countryside. This shift had profound social consequences. Where once hundreds of peasant families might have worked the land, now a handful of shepherds tended vast flocks. The displaced rural population drifted toward towns and cities, contributing to urbanization patterns that would define the early modern period. Urban centers themselves were transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. The massive mortality had created opportunities for civic reorganization. Streets were widened in some cities as abandoned properties were demolished. New regulations about waste disposal and water supply were implemented, born from the hard-learned lessons about disease transmission, even if the actual mechanisms remained misunderstood. The guild system, which had been one of the defining features of medieval urban life, underwent rapid evolution. With so many master craftsmen dead, the normal progression from apprentice to journeyman to master was accelerated. Young men who might have waited decades for the opportunity to establish their own workshops found themselves masters at ages that would have been unthinkable before the plague. This rapid advancement, however, came at a cost. The accumulated knowledge and refined techniques that had been passed down through generations of careful training were sometimes lost or diluted. The quality of craftsmanship in many trades declined for a generation as inexperienced workers tried to fill the shoes of deceased masters. The plague also accelerated technological innovation in unexpected ways. The labor shortage forced communities to find mechanical solutions to problems previously solved by human muscle. Water mills and windmills became more common and sophisticated. New agricultural tools were developed to allow fewer workers to cultivate larger areas. The printing press, when it arrived in the mid-15th century, found eager adoption partly because the plague had created such a shortage of scribes. The transformation of religious life continued long after the initial plague years. The massive mortality among the clergy had necessitated the rapid ordination of new priests, many of whom lacked the education and training of their predecessors. Latin literacy declined among the parish clergy, leading to increased use of vernacular languages in religious contexts. This linguistic shift had profound implications for European culture. As vernacular languages gained prestige and written form, national literatures began to flourish. The works of Chaucer in English, Boccaccio in Italian, and others writing in the decades after the plague helped establish their languages as vehicles for sophisticated literary expression. The plague years also saw the emergence of new forms of popular devotion that bypassed traditional church hierarchies. The cult of saints associated with plague protection, Saint Sebastian, Saint Roch, and others, flourished as people sought supernatural defenders against disease. Pilgrimage sites associated with plague miracles became major centers of devotion, drawing travelers from across Europe despite the ongoing danger of disease transmission. The medical profession, such as it was, underwent its own transformation in response to the plague. While medieval physicians remained wedded to classical theories that provided little help against epidemic disease, the practical experience of dealing with plague led to some genuine advances. The practice of quarantine, developed in Italian port cities, represented one of the first systematic public health measures in European history. Medical texts written in the aftermath of the plague show physicians grappling with the limitations of traditional knowledge. Some began to question the ancient authorities, noting that Galen and Hippocrates had never described anything like the plague. This questioning of classical authority, while limited, represented early steps toward the empirical observation that would eventually revolutionize medical science. The demographic recovery from the plague followed different patterns across Europe. Some regions, particularly in Eastern Europe where the plague had been less severe, recovered relatively quickly. Others, especially heavily urbanized areas in Italy and France, took centuries to regain their pre-plague populations. This uneven recovery contributed to shifting balances of power between European regions. The psychological legacy of the plague manifested in cultural productions for generations. The preoccupation with death that characterized late medieval art and literature reflected a society that had looked into the abyss and could never quite forget what it had seen. The image of death as a skeletal figure with a scythe, now so familiar in Western culture, emerged from this period of mass mortality. Yet alongside this morbid fascination came a new emphasis on the pleasures of earthly life. The eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, attitude that Boccaccio described among some plague survivors became a persistent undercurrent in European culture. The Renaissance celebration of human achievement and earthly beauty can be seen, in part, as a reaction to the plague's reminder of human mortality. The legal system also evolved in response to plague-related challenges. New laws were needed to deal with inheritance when entire families died simultaneously, with abandoned property, with labor contracts in a transformed economy. The expansion of legal frameworks to address these issues contributed to the development of more sophisticated legal systems that would characterize early modern Europe. Marriage patterns changed significantly in the post-plague world. With more economic opportunities available, young people could marry earlier than had been typical before the plague. The European marriage pattern of relatively late marriage and high rates of celibacy that had characterized the pre-plague period began to shift, with implications for population recovery and family structure. The role of women in society, briefly expanded during the immediate aftermath of the plague, became a site of continued tension. While many of the economic opportunities that had opened to women were gradually restricted as population recovered and male workers became more available, the precedent had been set. Women had demonstrated their capacity to run businesses, manage estates, and participate in economic life in ways that couldn't be entirely forgotten. International relations were also reshaped by the plague. The 100 Years' War between England and France was repeatedly interrupted by plague outbreaks, with armies disbanded and campaigns abandoned as disease swept through military camps. The demographic weakness caused by plague contributed to the eventual English loss of their French territories, fundamentally altering the political map of Europe. The plague's impact extended beyond Europe's borders as well. The same trade routes that had brought plague to Europe from Asia continued to spread it to new regions. North Africa experienced massive mortality, with some regions perhaps suffering even more than Europe. The Islamic world, from the Middle East to Moorish Spain, was transformed by the same demographic catastrophe. As we stand at the threshold of our next exploration, the sophisticated knowledge and practices that medieval people developed despite their technological limitations, we should remember that much of this knowledge was tested and refined in the crucible of the plague years. The catastrophe had revealed both the limitations and the strengths of medieval civilization, spurring innovations that would echo through the centuries. The Black Death remains perhaps history's greatest example of a biological event reshaping human civilization. It demonstrated that the grand narratives of history, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the clash of religions, the march of progress, could be suddenly derailed by forces too small to see. It showed that human societies, no matter how rigid they might appear, could be transformed almost overnight by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Yet it also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of human civilization, the capacity of survivors to rebuild, reimagine, and ultimately transcend catastrophe. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was scarred, but also somehow strengthened, more dynamic and creative than what had come before. The lost knowledge. What medieval people knew that we forgot. As we emerge from the devastation of the Black Death and turn our attention to the intellectual and practical achievements of medieval civilization, we encounter a paradox that challenges our modern assumptions about progress and knowledge. The medieval period, often dismissed as a dark age of ignorance and superstition, was in fact a time of remarkable innovation and sophisticated understanding in numerous fields, much of which has been lost to us or only recently rediscovered. These were people who, without the benefit of modern science or technology, developed complex solutions to the challenges of their world, solutions that in some cases surpass what we can achieve today. Let us begin with the foundation of all medieval life, agriculture, where we find farming techniques of surprising sophistication that sustained populations for centuries. The three-field system, widely adopted across Europe by the High Middle Ages, represented a profound understanding of soil management and crop rotation that wouldn't be scientifically explained until centuries later. Medieval farmers knew, through generations of accumulated observation, that land needed to rest, that certain crops depleted the soil while others restored it, that the careful rotation of grains, legumes, and fallow periods could maintain soil fertility indefinitely. Picture yourself walking through the agricultural landscape of 13th century England or France, and you would see fields arranged in a complex pattern that might seem random to modern eyes but actually represented centuries of refined wisdom. The open field system, with its strips of land cultivated by different families, wasn't merely a social arrangement but a sophisticated risk management strategy. By distributing each family's holdings across multiple fields with different soil types, drainage patterns, and sun exposures, communities ensured that no single weather event or localized problem could completely destroy a family's harvest. This scattered holding pattern, which modern agricultural efficiency experts might criticize, actually provided remarkable resilience against the uncertainties of medieval agriculture. The knowledge of soil types and their proper management was far more nuanced than we might expect. Medieval farmers distinguished between numerous soil types, each with its own name, characteristics, and optimal uses. They knew which soils needed marl or lime to improve fertility, which responded best to animal manure, and which required longer fallow periods. They understood drainage in ways that would impress modern agricultural engineers, creating elaborate systems of ditches, field drains, and water meadows that controlled moisture levels throughout the growing season. The water meadow system, in particular, represented a remarkably sophisticated understanding of irrigation and fertilization, using controlled flooding to deposit fertile silt and encourage early spring grass growth for livestock. Medieval farmers also possessed detailed knowledge of weather patterns and seasonal indicators that has largely been lost in our age of meteorological forecasts. They could read the subtlest signs in nature, the behavior of birds, the appearance of certain plants, the feel of the wind, to predict weather changes days in advance. This wasn't mere superstition but careful observation passed down through generations, creating a deep intimacy with local climate patterns that modern farmers, reliant on weather services, rarely develop. The breeding of livestock in medieval times showed understanding of genetic principles centuries before Mendel would formally describe them. Medieval farmers knew how to select for desirable traits, maintaining separate bloodlines and carefully recording which animals produced the best offspring. The great medieval horse breeds, the destrier for war, the palfrey for riding, the rouncey for general work, were created through selective breeding programs that required generations of careful observation and record-keeping. Moving from the fields to the medieval pharmacy, we find an herbal medicine tradition that modern science has validated in surprising ways. The medieval herbalists' knowledge represented thousands of years of accumulated empirical observation about the medicinal properties of plants, knowledge that pharmaceutical companies still mine today for new drug discoveries. Consider the medieval use of willow bark for pain and fever, containing the same active ingredient as modern aspirin. Or their use of foxglove for heart conditions, which provided the basis for the modern heart medication digitalis. The monks who carefully tended monastery herb gardens were engaged in what we would now recognize as pharmaceutical cultivation, growing and preparing medicines with standardized procedures to ensure consistent potency. The preparation methods for these herbal remedies showed remarkable sophistication. Medieval herbalists understood that different extraction methods, infusions, decoctions, tinctures, oils, would yield different medicinal compounds from the same plant. They knew that some herbs needed to be harvested at specific times of day or seasons to maximize their potency, that certain preparations required fermentation or aging, that some medicines needed to be combined with others to be effective or safe. The doctrine of signatures, the belief that plants resembling body parts could treat ailments of those parts, while seemingly superstitious to modern minds, actually led to numerous legitimate discoveries. Plants with liver-shaped leaves were used for liver conditions, and modern analysis has found that many of these plants do indeed contain hepatoprotective compounds. The medieval herbalists' careful observation of plant forms, while based on a flawed theoretical framework, resulted in practical medical knowledge that saved countless lives. Medieval wound treatment, too, showed surprising effectiveness. The use of honey and wine to clean wounds, practices described in medieval medical texts, provided antiseptic properties that wouldn't be scientifically understood until the discovery of bacteria. The medieval surgeon's insistence on wine-washed hands and instruments, while not understanding germ theory, created sterile conditions that dramatically improved patient survival rates. The knowledge of human anatomy possessed by medieval physicians, while limited by religious restrictions on dissection, was more sophisticated than commonly believed. Medieval surgeons successfully performed complex operations including cataract removal, caesarean sections, and even primitive forms of plastic surgery. They understood the importance of controlling bleeding, developed sophisticated suturing techniques, and knew how to manage post-operative care to prevent infection. But perhaps nowhere is medieval sophistication more evident than in the great cathedrals that still dominate European skylines. These structures represent engineering achievements that continue to baffle modern architects and engineers. The Gothic cathedral, with its soaring vaults, massive yet delicate-seeming stone structures, and walls of stained glass, required mathematical and engineering knowledge of extraordinary sophistication. Imagine yourself as a medieval master mason, tasked with building a structure that would reach toward heaven while defying gravity's pull. You would need to understand complex force distributions, calculate load-bearing capacities, and solve three-dimensional geometry problems without computers or even standardized mathematical notation. The flying buttress, that distinctive feature of Gothic architecture, represents a solution to structural problems that wouldn't be fully explained by physics until centuries later. Medieval builders understood empirically that these external supports could transfer the lateral forces of the heavy stone vaults away from the walls, allowing for larger windows and higher ceilings. They developed this solution through practical experience and careful observation of structural failures, creating engineering principles that modern computer modeling has confirmed as optimal. The acoustic properties of medieval cathedrals reveal another layer of lost knowledge. These buildings were designed not just as visual spaces, but as sonic environments, with every surface calculated to enhance and direct sound in specific ways. The placement of pillars, the curve of vaults, the positioning of galleries, all were calibrated to create acoustic effects that would carry a whispered prayer from the nave to the altar, or allow a choir's voice to fill the entire space without amplification. Modern acoustic engineers studying these buildings have discovered that medieval builders understood sound propagation in ways we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. They knew how to create acoustic sweet spots where sound would converge, how to use architectural features to filter certain frequencies while amplifying others, how to design spaces where multiple simultaneous conversations could occur without interference. The stained glass windows of medieval cathedrals represent lost knowledge of both chemistry and optics. The deep blue glass of Chartres Cathedral, for instance, was created using techniques that modern glassmakers cannot perfectly replicate. Medieval glaziers knew how to add metals and minerals to molten glass to achieve specific colors, how to control heating and cooling to prevent cracking, how to cut and shape glass with primitive tools to create intricate designs that would last centuries. The symbolic geometry embedded in cathedral design reveals a mathematical sophistication that went beyond mere practical engineering. These buildings were designed using sacred geometry, complex mathematical relationships that were believed to reflect divine proportions. The golden ratio, Fibonacci sequences, and other mathematical concepts were incorporated into every aspect of design, from the overall floor plan to the smallest decorative details. Medieval astronomy, conducted without telescopes or modern instruments, achieved remarkable accuracy in tracking celestial movements. Medieval astronomers created elaborate mechanical models of the cosmos, astrolabes and armillary spheres, that could predict planetary positions, eclipses, and other celestial events with surprising precision. The astrolabe, in particular, represents a level of mathematical and mechanical sophistication that seems almost impossible for its time. This instrument could be used to tell time, determine latitude, predict sunrise and sunset, calculate the height of buildings, and perform dozens of other calculations. It was essentially an analog computer, encoding complex mathematical relationships in brass and requiring deep understanding of spherical trigonometry to design and use. Medieval astronomers also maintained detailed observational records that modern scientists still reference. They tracked supernovae, recorded comet appearances, and documented subtle changes in star positions that wouldn't be explained until the discovery of stellar parallax. The medieval understanding of lunar and solar cycles was precise enough to create calendars that accurately predicted religious festivals years in advance. The construction of accurate sundials required sophisticated understanding of the sun's apparent motion throughout the year, accounting for seasonal variations and geographical latitude. Medieval sundial makers knew how to calculate the equation of time, the difference between solar time and clock time, centuries before mechanical clocks were accurate enough to detect this difference. Navigation techniques developed by medieval sailors demonstrated practical application of astronomical knowledge. Without magnetic compasses for most of the period, sailors relied on careful observation of sun and star positions, combined with detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns, currents, and bird migration routes. The Viking navigation using crystal sunstones to locate the sun through clouds represents a technology we've only recently understood, involving the polarization properties of certain crystals. Medieval metallurgy achieved results that modern science struggles to explain. The famous Damascus steel, with its distinctive watered pattern and legendary sharpness, was produced using techniques that created carbon nanotubes, structures that wouldn't be discovered by science until the 20th century. The exact methods for producing this steel were lost by the 17th century and have never been perfectly reproduced despite modern technology. The knowledge of acoustic resonance in medieval bell-making created instruments of remarkable tonal purity and carrying power. Medieval bell founders understood that the shape, thickness, and alloy composition of a bell all affected its sound, and they developed empirical formulas for achieving specific tones. Some medieval bells still ring today with a clarity and richness that modern bells rarely match, despite our superior understanding of acoustics. The lost knowledge extends to more mundane but equally important areas. Medieval tanners knew how to produce leather of extraordinary durability using brain tanning techniques that created softer, more water-resistant material than modern chemical tanning. Medieval dyers could create colors of remarkable fastness using only natural materials, achieving deep blacks and rich purples that wouldn't fade after centuries. The production of illuminated manuscripts required knowledge that crossed multiple disciplines. The preparation of vellum from animal skin, the mixing of inks and pigments, the application of gold leaf, the binding of books, each step required specialized knowledge that took years to master. The vivid blues made from lapis lazuli, the reds from cinnabar, the gold leaf beaten to impossible thinness, these materials were prepared using techniques that preserved their brilliance for a millennium. Medieval food preservation techniques, developed without refrigeration or modern preservatives, kept food safe for months or even years. The production of cheese, the smoking and salting of meats, the fermentation of vegetables, the brewing of Alash, all required precise understanding of processes that we now know involve complex microbiology. Medieval brewers, for instance, knew how to maintain yeast cultures, how to control fermentation temperatures, and how to achieve consistent results, all without understanding the microscopic organisms they were cultivating. The medieval understanding of forestry and woodland management created sustainable systems that maintained productive forests for centuries. They practiced coppicing and pollarding, techniques for harvesting wood while keeping trees alive and productive, that created woodland ecosystems of remarkable biodiversity. These managed forests provided not just timber but also fuel, food, medicine, and raw materials for countless crafts, all while maintaining ecological balance. Medieval crop storage techniques demonstrated sophisticated understanding of moisture control, temperature regulation, and pest management. The design of granaries with their carefully calculated ventilation systems, the use of specific herbs and materials to repel insects, the timing of harvest to optimize storage life, all represented accumulated knowledge that prevented famine and sustained populations through long winters. The organization of medieval crafts into guilds created systems for preserving and transmitting technical knowledge that was remarkably effective. Master craftsmen would spend years training apprentices, passing on not just techniques but also the subtle judgments and observational skills that separated competent work from mastery. This system preserved knowledge through generations, creating continuous traditions of expertise that lasted centuries. The guild system also encouraged innovation within traditional frameworks. Craftsmen were expected to produce a masterpiece to achieve master status, encouraging each generation to push the boundaries of their craft while maintaining core techniques. This balance between tradition and innovation created gradual refinement of techniques over centuries. Medieval mining techniques achieved remarkable depths and complexity without powered machinery. Miners developed sophisticated ventilation systems using fire to create air currents, drainage systems using water wheels and bucket chains, and supporting structures that prevented cave-ins. They could follow ore veins through complex geology, developing empirical understanding of geological formations that wouldn't be scientifically explained until much later. The extraction and processing of metals from or required chemical knowledge that medieval metalworkers understood practically even if they couldn't explain it theoretically. They knew which fluxes to add to lower melting points, how to control carbon content in iron to produce different grades of steel, how to alloy metals to achieve specific properties. The production of brass, bronze, and pewter with consistent properties required precise control of temperatures and proportions. Medieval water management systems demonstrated engineering knowledge of remarkable sophistication. The construction of mill races, aqueducts, and canal systems required understanding of hydraulics, including concepts like water pressure, flow rates, and erosion control. Medieval engineers could calculate the pitch needed for water channels, design overflow systems to prevent flooding, and create complex mechanisms powered entirely by water. The tide mills built in medieval times showed understanding of tidal patterns and mechanical engineering that allowed them to harness the reliable rhythm of the seas. These mills required precise calculation of gear ratios, understanding of tidal lag, and mechanical systems that could withstand the corrosive effects of salt water. Some medieval tide mills operated for centuries with only minor maintenance. Medieval timekeeping, before the widespread adoption of mechanical clocks, relied on sophisticated understanding of natural cycles. Water clocks, candle clocks, and sand glasses all required precise calibration and understanding of flow rates. The monastic communities that needed to maintain prayer schedules developed timekeeping methods of remarkable accuracy, including nocturnal observations of star positions to determine time during the night. The development of mechanical clocks in the late medieval period represented one of humanity's great technological achievements. These devices required precision metalworking, complex gear trains, and escapement mechanisms that regulated the release of energy. The astronomical clocks built in this period, showing not just time but also planetary positions, moon phases, and religious festivals, were mechanical computers of extraordinary complexity. Medieval cartography, while often mocked for its inaccuracies, actually represented sophisticated understanding of how to represent three-dimensional space on flat surfaces. The portolan charts used by medieval sailors were remarkably accurate for coastal navigation, using compass roses and distance measurements that allowed precise dead reckoning. These charts were created through careful compilation of sailing observations, creating collective knowledge that was constantly refined. The medieval understanding of climate and weather patterns extended beyond daily prediction to recognition of longer-term cycles. Chronicles record observations of climate variations, including what we now call the medieval warm period and the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Farmers and communities adapted their practices to these changes, showing resilience and flexibility that modern industrial agriculture often lacks. As we contemplate this vast array of lost knowledge, we must ask ourselves what other medieval innovations and understandings have vanished without trace. How many techniques, observations, and insights were never written down, passed orally from master to student until some catastrophe, plague, war, social change, broke the chain of transmission. The recovery and study of medieval knowledge continues to yield surprises. Modern materials scientists study medieval mortars that have proved more durable than modern concrete. Ethnobotanists investigate medieval herbals for medically active compounds. Architects analyze cathedral structures to understand principles of sustainable construction. Agricultural researchers examine medieval farming techniques for insights into sustainable food production. This lost knowledge reminds us that progress is not always linear, that valuable understanding can be forgotten as easily as it's gained. The medieval period, far from being a dark age of ignorance, was a time of remarkable human achievement, when careful observation, patient experimentation, and accumulated wisdom created technologies and understandings that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. The men and women who developed this knowledge were not primitive people stumbling in darkness, but sophisticated observers of their world, creating practical solutions to complex problems. They worked within different theoretical frameworks than we do, but their empirical observations were often remarkably accurate. They remind us that human ingenuity and careful observation can achieve remarkable results even without modern scientific methods. As we prepare to ascend from the workshops and fields where common knowledge was applied to the rarefied heights of noble halls and castles, we carry with us an appreciation for the depth and sophistication of medieval understanding. This was a civilization that, despite its limitations, achieved remarkable things through patient observation, careful preservation of knowledge, and willingness to build on the achievements of previous generations. The transmission of this medieval knowledge often occurred through means we might find surprising today. Memory techniques developed in medieval monasteries and universities allowed scholars to memorize vast amounts of information with remarkable accuracy. The method of loci, or memory palace technique, where information was associated with specific locations in an imagined building, enabled medieval scholars to carry entire libraries in their minds. These memory techniques weren't mere party tricks, but essential tools in a world where books were rare and expensive. A medieval scholar might memorize hundreds of texts, cross-referencing them mentally in ways that seem almost superhuman to our Google-dependent minds. The architectural metaphors used in these memory systems influenced how medieval thinkers organized knowledge itself, creating conceptual structures that shaped European thought for centuries. The medieval approach to education, while limited in its availability, produced depths of learning that modern education rarely achieves. Students in medieval universities would spend years studying single texts, developing interpretive skills and analytical capabilities that went far beyond simple memorization. The disputatio, the formal academic debate, trained minds to consider questions from multiple angles, to construct logical arguments, and to defend positions against rigorous challenge. Medieval legal knowledge represented another sophisticated tradition now largely forgotten. The complex systems of customary law that governed most of medieval Europe required deep understanding of precedent, tradition, and local custom. Village elders who served as judges in manorial courts carried in their memories entire legal codes, precedents stretching back generations, and the intricate web of obligations and rights that structured their communities. The concept of law-worthy men who could serve as oath helpers in legal proceedings required detailed knowledge of every person's reputation, family history, and social standing. This system, while alien to modern legal thinking, created forms of community justice that maintained social order for centuries without professional lawyers or written legal codes. Medieval music theory achieved mathematical sophistication that wouldn't be equaled until the modern era. The development of polyphony, multiple independent melodic lines sung simultaneously, required understanding of mathematical ratios and harmonic relationships. Medieval music theorists calculated precise frequency ratios for intervals, developed notation systems to capture complex rhythms, and created compositional techniques that could produce intricate musical structures. The acoustic design of churches and monasteries was calibrated to enhance specific types of music. Gregorian chant, for instance, was composed with the reverberant properties of stone churches in mind, using the building's natural acoustics as part of the musical instrument. The loss of these acoustic spaces means we can never truly hear medieval music as it was intended to be heard. Medieval knowledge of materials extended to understanding of how different substances interacted with each other over time. Manuscript illuminators knew that certain pigments couldn't be placed adjacent to each other without chemical reactions occurring, sometimes not visible for years. They developed binding media and varnishes that would protect their work for centuries, understanding the aging properties of materials in ways that modern conservation scientists are still discovering. The production of weapons and armor in medieval times required metallurgical knowledge of extraordinary sophistication. A master armorer could judge the carbon content of steel by its spark pattern, could heat-treat different parts of a single piece to achieve varying hardness and flexibility, could create articulated joints that provided protection while allowing movement. The famous medieval swords that could be bent nearly double without breaking required understanding of differential heat treatment that created hard edges with flexible cores. Medieval understanding of animal behavior, developed through centuries of close observation, has largely been lost in our industrialized world. Falconers possessed detailed knowledge of raptor psychology and training techniques that modern falconers struggle to recreate. Hunters understood animal migration patterns, feeding behaviors, and seasonal movements with precision that modern wildlife biologists achieve only through radio tracking and systematic study. The training of war horses required understanding of equine psychology and conditioning that went far beyond simple riding skills. A destrier trained for battle had to overcome its natural flight instincts, to charge into situations that every instinct told it to avoid. The techniques for achieving this training, passed down through generations of horse masters, created animals of extraordinary courage and capability. Medieval knowledge of fermentation extended beyond brewing and winemaking to include production of vinegars, fermented foods, and even industrial processes. The production of woad and indigo dyes required controlled fermentation processes that medieval dyers managed through empirical observation of color, smell, and temperature. They knew how to maintain the bacterial cultures necessary for fermentation without understanding that bacteria existed. The medieval understanding of symbiotic relationships in agriculture showed ecological sophistication we're only now rediscovering. They knew that certain plants grew better together, that some crops prepared the soil for others, that encouraging certain weeds could actually improve overall productivity. The medieval practice of leaving field margins wild to harbor beneficial insects represents an early understanding of biological pest control. Medieval knowledge of seasonal rhythms extended to understanding of human biological cycles as well. Medical texts describe seasonal variations in disease susceptibility, dietary recommendations that changed with the seasons, and recognition of what we now call seasonal affective disorder. Monastic communities structured their routines to account for seasonal variations in daylight, adjusting prayer times and work schedules in ways that recognized human circadian rhythms. The organization of medieval markets and fairs demonstrated sophisticated understanding of economic principles. The regulation of weights and measures, the systems for ensuring quality, the credit mechanisms that allowed long-distance trade, all required practical economic knowledge that wouldn't be theoretically described until centuries later. Medieval merchants developed methods for calculating compound interest, managing currency exchange, and assessing risk that formed the foundation of modern banking. The medieval approach to mental illness, while including elements we would consider superstitious, also showed surprising insights. Some medieval hospitals provided what we would recognize as occupational therapy, giving patients meaningful work to aid recovery. The use of music, garden work, and structured routines in treating melancholy and other mental conditions showed empirical understanding of therapeutic approaches that modern psychiatry has validated. Medieval knowledge of textiles went beyond simple weaving to include understanding of fiber properties, dye chemistry, and fabric construction that created textiles of remarkable durability and beauty. The production of tapestries required not just artistic skill, but understanding of how different fibers would age, how colors would interact when woven together, how to achieve structural integrity in large-scale weavings that would hang for centuries. The preservation techniques for organic materials developed in medieval times often surpass modern methods. Medieval tanners, parchment makers, and bookbinders created products that have survived centuries in conditions that would destroy modern materials. Their understanding of how to balance flexibility with durability, how to prevent biological decay without toxic chemicals, represents knowledge that sustainable materials scientists are now trying to recover. Medieval shipbuilding techniques created vessels that could withstand ocean conditions using only wood and natural materials. The clinker-built ships of Northern Europe and the carvel-built vessels of the Mediterranean represented different solutions to the same engineering challenges, each optimized for local conditions and available materials. The knowledge of how wood behaves in water, how to create watertight seals using natural materials, how to design hulls that could flex without breaking. All this represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. As we stand at the threshold of our final segment, preparing to enter the great halls of medieval nobility, we should pause to appreciate the depth and breadth of knowledge we've explored. The medieval world was not a darkness waiting for the light of modern science, but a complex civilization with its own sophisticated understanding of the natural and constructed world. This knowledge, developed through patient observation and transmitted through careful teaching, created the foundation upon which our modern world was built. The cathedrals still standing after 8 centuries, the manuscripts still readable after a millennium, the agricultural landscapes still productive after countless harvests, all testify to the effectiveness of medieval knowledge. The loss of this knowledge represents not just historical curiosity but practical wisdom that might help address modern challenges. As we face issues of sustainability, resource depletion, and environmental degradation, the medieval examples of long-term thinking, sustainable practices, and community resilience offer valuable lessons. These were people who thought in centuries, who built for permanence, who understood their dependence on natural cycles in ways we've forgotten in our technological confidence. A lord's heavy crown, feasts, politics, and constant paranoia. As we ascend from the mud-caked fields and smoky hovels of the peasantry, climbing the steep path that leads to the castle perched above the village, we enter a world that seems, at first glance, to be everything the peasant's life was not, a realm of luxury, power, and privilege that medieval storytellers would transform into the stuff of romance and legend. Yet as we pass through the heavily fortified gates, cross the drawbridge that spans a moat filled with murky water, and enter the great stone halls where lords and ladies held court, we discover that the life of medieval nobility was its own form of bondage, gilded perhaps, but no less constraining than the chains that bound the serf to his land. The castle itself, that iconic symbol of medieval power, tells us much about the reality of noble life. These were not the fairy tale palaces of later imagination, but functional fortresses designed first for defense, only secondarily for comfort. Picture yourself waking as a medieval lord in your private chamber, one of the few rooms in the castle with any claim to privacy, though even here, servants would be sleeping on pallets near the door, ready to attend to your needs. The room would be cold, even in summer, for stone walls and narrow windows designed to repel arrows rather than admit light created a perpetual chill that no amount of tapestries could entirely dispel. In winter, despite the massive fireplace that dominated one wall, the cold would be bone-deep, requiring multiple layers of clothing even indoors, fur-lined robes that were as much necessity as status symbol. Your morning would begin not with solitary contemplation but with ceremony, for a medieval lord was never truly alone. servants would enter to help you dress, a process that could take an hour or more, as the elaborate clothing of nobility required assistance to properly don and arrange. Each garment was a statement of rank and wealth: fine linen undergarments, woolen or silk tunics, elaborate belt with precious metal fittings, soft leather shoes with extended points that fashion dictated despite their impracticality. The first meal of the day would be taken in the great hall, that central space that served as the heart of castle life. Here, hierarchy was displayed in physical form. The lord and his family seated at the high table, raised above the rest of the room, eating from silver or pewter plates, while lesser nobles and household knights sat at lower tables with implements of progressively baser materials as rank decreased. But let us pause to consider what this luxury actually meant in practical terms. Yes, a lord had access to foods that peasants could only dream of: white bread made from refined wheat, fresh meat daily, exotic spices imported at enormous cost from the far reaches of the known world. Yet this diet, rich in meat and lacking in fresh vegetables for much of the year, brought its own health problems. Gout, the disease of kings, was endemic among the nobility, causing excruciating joint pain that medieval medicine could do little to alleviate. The famous medieval feast, those elaborate affairs that could last for hours and feature dozens of courses, were not daily occurrences but carefully orchestrated political theater. A great feast might be held to celebrate a marriage alliance, to mark a religious festival, or to demonstrate wealth and power to rivals. The preparations for such an event would begin weeks in advance, with hunters sent out to procure game, merchants commissioned to obtain rare delicacies, and kitchen staff working around the clock. Picture yourself attending such a feast as an honored guest. You would enter the great hall to find it transformed, with fresh rushes on the floor mixed with herbs to sweeten the air, additional tables brought in to accommodate the guests, walls hung with the lord's finest tapestries depicting scenes of hunting or biblical stories. Musicians would be playing from the gallery above, their music competing with the din of conversation and the clatter of serving dishes. The feast would begin with the washing of hands, an elaborate ceremony where servants would bring silver basins and fine linen towels to each guest in order of rank. Then would come the procession of dishes, each one announced and presented with flourish. A typical feast might include roasted swans redressed in their feathers, peacocks served with their tail feathers displayed, whole roasted boars with apples in their mouths, elaborate pies called coffins that might contain live birds that would fly out when the crust was cut. Between courses there would be entertainment, minstrels singing songs of courtly love and heroic deeds, jesters performing acrobatics and telling jokes that walked the fine line between humor and insult, perhaps even theatrical performances of biblical or classical stories. These entertainments served multiple purposes: providing distraction during the long gaps between courses, demonstrating the lord's wealth and cultural sophistication, and sometimes conveying political messages through allegory and symbol. But beneath the surface splendor of such occasions lurked constant danger and calculation. Every feast was a political gathering where alliances were negotiated, rivals were assessed, and plots were potentially hatched. The lord hosting the feast had to carefully consider the seating arrangement, ensuring that allies were honored and potential enemies were neither insulted nor given opportunity to conspire. Food tasters would sample each dish before it reached the high table, for poison was a constant fear. The burden of hospitality was both a social obligation and a potential financial disaster. Custom dictated that a lord must provide appropriate entertainment for guests of rank, but such visits could last weeks or even months, with the entire retinue requiring food, accommodation, and entertainment. A visit from the king could literally bankrupt a noble family, as they were expected to provide luxury beyond their normal means as a demonstration of loyalty and respect. The military obligations that came with noble status were perhaps the heaviest burden of all. In exchange for their lands and privileges, nobles owed military service to their liege lord, typically 40 days per year, though this could be extended in times of war. This meant maintaining expensive military equipment, armor that could cost as much as a village, war horses that required special training and care, weapons that needed constant maintenance. A lord was expected not just to appear for military service himself, but to bring a retinue of armed men appropriate to his holdings. This meant maintaining a household guard, training young knights, and ensuring that all were properly equipped. The cost was staggering, consuming much of the income from even substantial estates. War itself was a peculiar mix of extreme danger and social occasion for the medieval nobility. On one hand, battles were genuinely deadly affairs where a lord might face death or maiming despite his superior armor. On the other hand, there was an elaborate code of chivalric conduct that meant captured nobles were usually ransomed rather than killed, turning warfare into a potentially profitable, if risky, enterprise. The management of estates that supported this noble lifestyle required skills that went far beyond military prowess. A lord was essentially the CEO of a complex agricultural and economic enterprise, overseeing multiple manors, each with its own villages, fields, forests, and mills. This required understanding of agricultural cycles, knowledge of legal precedents, ability to adjudicate disputes, and skill in financial management. Most lords employed a small army of administrators to handle daily operations, stewards to oversee individual manors, bailiffs to supervise agricultural work, reeves elected by villagers to serve as intermediaries, clerks to keep records and maintain accounts. The lord himself was expected to regularly tour his estates, holding court to dispense justice, reviewing accounts, and maintaining the personal relationships that held the feudal system together. The dispensation of justice was one of the most important and dangerous aspects of noble life. A lord holding court had the power of life and death over his subjects, but this power came with constraints and dangers. Too harsh, and he might provoke rebellion; too lenient, and he would lose respect and authority. Every decision created winners and losers, friends and enemies. Legal proceedings in a manor court were public affairs, with the entire community watching as their lord passed judgment on everything from property disputes to criminal cases. The lord had to balance customary law, royal decrees, church law, and practical politics in making decisions. A wrong judgment could lead to appeals to higher authorities, potentially bringing unwanted scrutiny from more powerful nobles or even the king. The education of noble children reflected the complex demands that would be placed upon them as adults. Boys were typically sent at age 7 to serve as pages in another noble household, beginning their training in military arts, courtly behavior, and estate management. This fostering system created networks of obligation and alliance that would shape politics for generations. The training of a young noble was comprehensive and harsh. Pages would learn to serve at table, care for armor and weapons, and basic literacy and numeracy. At 14, they might become squires, personally attending a knight, learning the practical skills of warfare, participating in hunts and tournaments. The path to knighthood, typically achieved around age 21, required not just military skill but demonstration of proper noble behavior, understanding of chivalric codes, and often substantial payment to cover the ceremony. Noble girls faced a different but equally demanding preparation for their adult roles. They would learn to manage large households, oversee servants, maintain accounts, and handle the complex social negotiations of court life. They studied music, dancing, embroidery, and other accomplishments that would make them desirable marriage partners. Many noble women were literate, some highly educated, as they might need to manage estates during their husbands' frequent absences. Marriage among the nobility was rarely about love and almost always about politics and property. Marriages were arranged to create alliances, resolve conflicts, or consolidate holdings. A noble woman might be betrothed as a child to a man she'd never met, sent to live in his household to be raised alongside her future husband. The Church's prohibition on divorce meant that an unhappy marriage was a life sentence, though annulments could sometimes be obtained through claims of consanguinity or non-consummation. The role of noble women was more complex and powerful than popular history often suggests. While legally subordinate to their husbands, noble women often wielded considerable practical authority. When lords were away on military campaigns, which could last months or years, their wives managed estates, dispensed justice, and even defended castles against siege. Some women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, became powerful political players in their own right. The daily routine of castle life was structured around the twin poles of security and ceremony. Gates were opened at dawn and closed at dusk, with guards maintaining watch through the night. The day was punctuated by religious observances, morning mass in the castle chapel, prayers before meals, evening vespers. These religious obligations were not optional. They were essential to maintaining the divine sanction that legitimized noble power. The castle chapel was often one of the most elaborate rooms in the fortress, decorated with expensive stained glass, furnished with precious vessels for the Mass, sometimes containing holy relics that had cost fortunes to acquire. The castle chaplain was usually an educated man who served not just as spiritual advisor, but often as secretary, tutor, and diplomatic courier. The paranoia that pervaded noble life was not unfounded but based on very real threats. Assassination attempts were common enough that elaborate precautions became routine. Food tasters, as mentioned, were standard at noble tables. Bedchambers were guarded through the night. Even within their own castles, lords rarely moved without armed escorts. The threat could come from many directions: rival nobles seeking to expand their power, ambitious relatives who stood to inherit, displaced peasants seeking revenge for harsh treatment, or agents of foreign powers. The castle itself, while providing protection, could become a trap if besieged. Every lord had to maintain supplies sufficient to withstand a siege that might last months, including preserved food, weapons, and most critically, a secure water supply. The medieval castle's architecture reflected these security concerns in every detail. Spiral staircases turned clockwise going up, giving advantage to right-handed defenders facing downward. Multiple gates and portcullises created kill zones where attackers could be trapped. Arrow slits were angled to provide maximum coverage while minimizing exposure. Secret passages allowed for escape or surprise attacks on besiegers. Yet despite all these precautions, castle life was far from impregnable isolation. A successful lord had to maintain a careful balance between security and accessibility. He needed to receive petitioners, entertain guests, and maintain the social connections essential to political survival. The Great Hall had to be both fortress and court, a place where power was displayed and negotiated. The economic pressures on medieval nobility were constant and growing throughout the period. The lifestyle expected of nobles, the clothing, the feasting, the military equipment, the large households required enormous income. Yet the agricultural economy that supported them was relatively static, producing only modest surpluses in good years. Many nobles were perpetually in debt, borrowing from Jewish moneylenders or Italian banking houses at ruinous interest rates. The rise of the money economy in the later medieval period created new pressures. Where once obligations had been paid in service and agricultural produce, increasingly they were commuted to cash payments. This gave peasants more freedom, but required lords to manage complex financial affairs. Some adapted successfully, becoming entrepreneurial landlords who improved agricultural productivity and developed commercial enterprises. Others, unable to adapt, saw their power and influence steadily erode. The culture of chivalry that supposedly governed noble behavior was both a genuine ideal and a convenient fiction. The chivalric codes that required knights to protect the weak, defend the church, and show courtesy to noble women were regularly honored in the breach. The same knight who composed elaborate poems to his lady might brutally rape peasant women during military campaigns. The protection of the weak usually extended only to those of appropriate social standing, yet the ideal of chivalry did shape behavior in important ways. It created standards against which nobles were judged, even if they often fell short. It provided a framework for limiting the violence endemic to a warrior aristocracy. The elaborate rules of tournaments, for instance, channeled martial aggression into relatively controlled competitions that, while dangerous, were less destructive than actual warfare. Tournaments themselves deserve consideration as central events in noble life. These were not simple martial competitions, but elaborate social gatherings that could last days or weeks. A major tournament would draw nobles from across regions, creating temporary cities of pavilions and tents. There would be multiple events, individual jousts, group melees, archery competitions, and displays of horsemanship. For young knights, tournaments offered opportunities to gain reputation, win prizes, and catch the attention of potential patrons. For established nobles, they provided venues for political negotiation, display of wealth, and maintenance of military skills. For noble women, tournaments were social occasions where marriages might be arranged and courtly romance rituals performed. The dangers of tournament participation were real. Despite rules and blunted weapons, deaths and serious injuries were common. A lord might be killed or maimed in what was essentially a sporting event, leaving his family vulnerable and his estates leaderless. Yet participation was socially mandatory. A noble who avoided tournaments would be considered cowardly, losing the respect essential to maintaining authority. The intellectual life of the nobility varied enormously. Some nobles were highly educated, literate in Latin and French, familiar with classical texts, patrons of art and literature. Others were barely literate, focused entirely on military pursuits and estate management. The stereotype of the brutish, ignorant noble has some basis in reality, but many nobles were sophisticated consumers and sometimes producers of medieval high culture. Noble patronage was essential to medieval artistic and intellectual achievement. The great cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and literary works of the period were largely funded by noble wealth. Lords and ladies commissioned books of hours, tapestries, and architectural projects both for personal enjoyment and as displays of power and piety. The competition among nobles to demonstrate cultural sophistication drove much of medieval artistic innovation. The health challenges faced by nobility, despite their better nutrition and living conditions, were substantial. The stone castles were damp and cold, promoting respiratory ailments. The rich diet led to digestive problems and gout. Injuries from hunting, tournaments, and warfare often resulted in permanent disabilities. Medieval medicine, while more accessible to nobles than peasants, was still limited in its effectiveness. Mental health issues among the nobility were common but rarely acknowledged directly. The stresses of constant political maneuvering, the isolation of power, and the real dangers they faced took psychological tolls. Chronicles occasionally mention nobles who went mad, but more common were what we might now recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, and paranoid behaviors that were considered normal given their circumstances. The religious life of nobles was complex and often contradictory. They were expected to be defenders of the faith, generous patrons of the church, and models of Christian virtue. Yet their lifestyle often conflicted with Christian teachings about humility, charity, and peace. Many nobles attempted to resolve this contradiction through dramatic gestures, funding monasteries, going on pilgrimage, or taking crusading vows. The Crusades represented a unique outlet for noble ambitions and anxieties. They offered opportunities for younger sons to gain lands, for indebted nobles to escape creditors, and for all to gain spiritual merit through military service. Yet crusading was enormously expensive and dangerous. Many nobles bankrupted themselves equipping crusading expeditions, and mortality rates were high from both combat and disease. As the medieval period progressed, the position of the nobility became increasingly precarious. The growth of royal power meant that nobles had less autonomy. The rise of professional armies reduced their military importance. The growth of commerce created new sources of wealth outside the traditional agricultural economy. By the late medieval period, many nobles found themselves caught between the old feudal world that was passing away and a new world they didn't fully understand. The Black Death, which we explored earlier, had particularly complex effects on the nobility. While they suffered lower mortality rates than peasants due to better nutrition and less crowded living conditions, the social and economic disruptions affected them profoundly. The shortage of agricultural workers meant higher wages and reduced income from estates. The breakdown of traditional hierarchies challenged the divine right that justified their privileges. Some nobles adapted to these changes, transforming themselves into what would become the early modern aristocracy. They developed commercial enterprises, invested in trade, and adapted to the money economy. Others clung to traditional ways, becoming increasingly impoverished and irrelevant. The Wars of the Roses in England, where noble families destroyed each other in dynastic conflict, exemplified the self-destructive tendencies of a class struggling to maintain relevance. The personal relationships among medieval nobles were shaped by the peculiar intimacies and distances of their world. They might know every detail of each other's genealogies, stretching back generations, yet meet in person only rarely. Letters, carried by trusted messengers, maintained connections across vast distances. These letters, some of which survive, reveal complex personalities navigating difficult circumstances with varying degrees of success. The emotional life of medieval nobles, glimpsed through chronicles, letters, and literature, shows people not so different from ourselves despite the vast cultural gulf. They loved their children, mourned their dead, felt joy in success and despair in failure. The elaborate formality of court life masked, but didn't eliminate human emotions and relationships. As we prepare to conclude our journey through medieval times, we should reflect on what the life of the nobility tells us about power, privilege, and human nature. These were people born to advantages unimaginable to the vast majority of their contemporaries, yet their lives were often marked by fear, constraint, and ultimately, failure to maintain the system that elevated them. The castle, that great symbol of noble power, stands now mostly in ruins, its broken walls testament to the impermanence of earthly authority. Yet in their time, these fortresses and the people who inhabited them shaped the course of European civilization. The tensions between nobles and monarchs helped create constitutional limitations on royal power. The culture of chivalry, however imperfectly realized, contributed to ideas about honorable conduct and protection of the vulnerable. The patronage of nobles preserved and transmitted classical knowledge through the medieval period. The medieval nobility, for all their flaws and failures, were human beings trying to navigate a complex and dangerous world with the tools available to them. They were simultaneously oppressors and victims, powerful and vulnerable, cultured and brutal. Their story reminds us that privilege does not eliminate human suffering, that power brings its own forms of bondage, and that even those who seem to have everything can lose it all in the turn of fortune's wheel. As we prepare to leave the medieval world behind and return to our modern comforts, we might pause to consider what echoes of medieval nobility persist in our own time. The concentration of wealth and power, the obligations of privilege, the paranoia of the powerful, the display of status through consumption, these patterns, established in medieval halls, continue to shape our world in ways we don't always recognize. The legacy of medieval nobility extends into the most intimate aspects of their daily existence, aspects we have not yet fully explored. The sexuality and romantic life of nobles was governed by contradictions that would seem impossible to navigate by modern standards. On one hand, the Church preached absolute chastity outside of marriage and restraint within it. On the other, noble culture celebrated romantic love, albeit in highly stylized forms, and noble men were expected to demonstrate virility through numerous offspring, legitimate or otherwise. The concept of courtly love, that elaborate game of romantic pursuit that fills medieval literature, was both real and performative. A knight might dedicate his tournament victories to a lady, compose poetry in her honor, and perform elaborate acts of service, all while both parties were married to others. This ritualized adultery of the heart was somehow considered ennobling, even as actual adultery could result in severe punishment, particularly for women. Noble bedchambers witnessed scenes of remarkable awkwardness by modern standards. The consummation of noble marriages was often a public affair, with witnesses present to ensure the union was properly completed, essential for establishing the legitimacy of future heirs. The marriage bed would be blessed by priests, sprinkled with holy water, and surrounded by relatives and courtiers who would only withdraw after confirming the couple was properly positioned for procreation. The production of heirs was perhaps the most crucial duty of noble marriage, yet it was fraught with danger and disappointment. Noble women faced the same risks in childbirth as peasant women, but with the added pressure that their failure to produce male heirs could result in political catastrophe. The death of a noble woman in childbirth might trigger succession crises that could lead to wars lasting generations. Children who survived infancy in noble households faced their own unique challenges. While they enjoyed material advantages unknown to peasant children, they were also pawns in political games from birth. A noble child might be betrothed in infancy, sent as a hostage to guarantee treaties, or raised in enemy households as insurance against their parents' rebellion. The emotional toll of these practices on both children and parents can only be imagined. The treatment of illegitimate children reveals another aspect of noble life's complexity. Bastards, as they were bluntly called, occupied a liminal space in medieval society. They might be acknowledged and educated, even given positions of responsibility, but they could not inherit titles or legitimate estates. Some bastards of noble blood achieved great things. William the Conqueror himself was William the Bastard before his conquest of England, but most lived in the shadow of their legitimate siblings, useful but never fully accepted. The private devotions of medieval nobles reveal attempts to reconcile their worldly power with spiritual concerns. Many nobles maintained private chapels where they would pray alone or with intimate family members, away from the performative piety of public worship. Books of Hours, those elaborately illuminated prayer books, were among nobles' most prized possessions, their marginalia sometimes revealing personal struggles and fears that public documents never mentioned. The keeping of relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, vials of holy blood was both spiritual practice and political tool. A noble family's collection of relics demonstrated both piety and power, as authentic relics were enormously expensive and difficult to obtain. The chapel containing important relics might become a pilgrimage site, bringing both spiritual merit and economic benefit to the noble house. Death, when it came to the castle, was an elaborate performance that could last days or weeks. A dying noble was expected to make a good death, confessing sins, forgiving enemies, distributing alms, and providing for dependents. The deathbed was a public space where political settlements were negotiated, inheritances confirmed, and final instructions given. The ability to face death with courage and piety was seen as the ultimate test of noble character. The funeral of a great noble was an event that could bankrupt estates. The body would be embalmed, dressed in finest clothes, and displayed for viewing. The funeral procession might stretch for miles, with professional mourners, clergy, servants, and retainers all in prescribed positions. The tomb itself was a final statement of power and piety, carved with effigies that would preserve the noble's image for eternity, though often idealized beyond recognition. The seasonal rhythms of noble life provided structure to the year, but also imposed their own burdens. Christmas courts were times of obligatory generosity when lords were expected to distribute gifts that could consume months of income. The summer progress, when great nobles would travel between their estates, required elaborate preparation and could devastate the households required to provide hospitality. Hunting, that most aristocratic of pursuits, deserves special attention as it was far more than simple recreation. The hunt was a ritual that reinforced social hierarchies, demonstrated martial prowess, and provided practical training for war. The elaborate rules governing who could hunt what animals, where, and when were markers of social status. Poaching the king's deer was a capital offense, while the right to hunt certain animals was a carefully guarded privilege. The culture of hunting shaped the medieval landscape itself. Vast areas were set aside as hunting forests, governed by special laws that prioritized game preservation over human needs. Entire villages might be cleared to create hunting parks. The maintenance of these spaces required armies of foresters, parkers, and other specialists who existed solely to provide nobility with their sport. The nighttime life of medieval castles was a world apart from the daytime routines. After dark, when gates were barred and most servants dismissed, different activities emerged. Gambling with dice and cards, officially condemned by the church, was endemic among nobles with time and money to waste. Affairs and assignations that couldn't be conducted in daylight found opportunity in the confused darkness of castle corridors. The role of alcohol in noble life was complex and problematic. Wine and ale were safer than water and consumed in enormous quantities. A typical noble might drink several pints of wine daily, starting with breakfast. This constant mild intoxication was considered normal, but actual drunkenness was both common and dangerous. Political agreements made while drunk might be repudiated when sober. Violent quarrels could escalate to bloodshed, and the vulnerability of an intoxicated lord invited assassination. The spy networks that operated within and between noble households reveal the paranoid reality of medieval politics. Servants were regularly bribed to report on their master's activities. False friends gathered intelligence while sharing wine and dice. Even family members might be reporting to rival factions. The successful noble had to assume that nothing said or done in the castle was truly private, adding another layer of stress to already complicated lives. As dawn approaches in our narrative, and we prepare to conclude this long journey through medieval times, we might consider what it truly meant to wear the heavy crown of nobility. These were people trapped between worlds, warrior aristocrats in an increasingly commercial age, defenders of a faith that condemned their lifestyle, rulers whose power depended on the consent of those they ruled. Their castles, those monuments to power and paranoia, stand now as reminders that all earthly authority is temporary, that the mightiest fortress will eventually fall to time if not to enemies. As our long journey through the medieval world draws to its close, and the first pale light of dawn begins to creep across the horizon of our historical exploration, we find ourselves standing at the threshold between two worlds, the distant past we have visited, and the present moment where you lie, comfortable and safe, preparing perhaps for sleep. The contrast between these two realities could hardly be more profound, yet the threads that connect them are stronger and more numerous than we might initially imagine. We have walked together through nearly 1,000 years of human experience, from the muddy fields where peasants labored from dawn to dusk, through plague-emptied cities where the dead outnumbered the living, into workshops and monasteries where knowledge was carefully preserved and transmitted, and finally into the great stone halls where nobles played their dangerous games of power and privilege. Each life we've examined, each story we've told, represents not just historical curiosity, but a testament to the endurance of the human spirit under conditions that would challenge our very survival. Think back to where we began, with that medieval peasant rising in darkness, their body aching from yesterday's labor, facing another day of backbreaking work with only the simplest tools and the strength of their own muscles. Consider the gap between their experience and yours, the warm bed you occupy, the climate-controlled room, the abundance of food in your kitchen, the medical care available should you need it, the freedom to choose your occupation, to travel, to speak your mind without fear of futile retribution. Yet for all these differences, the fundamental human experiences remain remarkably consistent. The love of parents for their children, the fear of death and disease, the hope for a better future, the need for community and belonging, the search for meaning in the face of suffering. These threads run through medieval and modern lives alike. The peasant watching their child take first steps, the plague survivor rebuilding their life after unimaginable loss, the craftsman perfecting their skill, the noble struggling to protect their family. All would recognize the emotions and motivations that drive us still. The Black Death, that catastrophe we explored in such detail, offers particular resonance for our modern world, having so recently experienced our own pandemic. While our medical knowledge allowed us to respond in ways medieval people could not imagine, the social disruptions, the economic upheavals, the psychological toll of isolation and fear, these would have been entirely familiar to survivors of the 14th century plague. They too knew the strange silence of empty streets, the fear of human contact, the grief of saying goodbye to loved ones from a distance. The sophistication of medieval knowledge that we discovered challenges our assumptions about progress and reminds us that wisdom can take many forms. Those cathedral builders who created structures that have stood for 8 centuries, those farmers who maintained soil fertility for generations, those healers who discovered medicinal properties of plants through careful observation, they possessed understanding that we have sometimes lost in our rush toward technological solutions. Consider how different our relationship with time has become. Medieval people lived by the rhythm of seasons and the cycle of religious festivals, their days measured by the movement of the sun rather than the ticking of clocks. They thought in generations, building cathedrals their grandchildren would complete, planting trees whose shade they would never enjoy. We, by contrast, live in an eternal present, checking our phones hundreds of times daily, consuming information in a constant stream, rarely planning beyond the next quarter or election cycle. The medieval acceptance of hierarchy and fixed social position seems almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, yet it provided a kind of certainty that we have lost. The peasant knew their place, harsh though it might be, and found meaning within those constraints. The noble knew their obligations, heavy though they were, and derived purpose from fulfilling them. We have gained freedom, but lost the clarity of defined roles and expectations, leaving each individual to construct their own meaning in a world that offers infinite choices but little guidance. The role of religion in medieval life presents another stark contrast with modernity. For medieval people, the divine was immediately present in daily life, in the consecrated host at Mass, in the relics that performed miracles, in the demons that caused disease and the saints who protected against them. This enchanted worldview, where supernatural forces constantly intervened in human affairs, provided explanations for suffering and hope for redemption that secular modernity struggles to replace. Yet we should not romanticize medieval faith as simple or comforting. The fear of damnation was real and terrible, the demands of religious observance were burdensome, and the Church's earthly representatives were often corrupt and cruel. The medieval God was as likely to punish as to protect, and the path to salvation was narrow and difficult to navigate. The transformation of death from a public, communal experience to a private, medicalized event represents one of the most profound changes between medieval and modern life. Medieval people died at home, surrounded by family and community, their passing marked by rituals that had been performed for centuries. Death was familiar, expected, prepared for. We have pushed death to the margins of life, hiding it in hospitals and funeral homes, making it strange and terrible in its unfamiliarity. The medieval understanding of community, born of necessity and enforced by circumstance, created bonds that we have largely lost. Village communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, where mutual aid was essential for survival, where individual desires were subordinated to collective needs. These seem suffocating to modern individualists, yet they provided support and meaning that many now desperately seek. As you lie in comfort, perhaps drowsy now from our long journey through time, consider what we have truly lost and gained in the transition from medieval to modern life. We have gained comfort, health, freedom, and opportunity beyond medieval imagination. A medieval peasant transported to our time would think themselves in paradise. Abundant food, warm homes, freedom from most diseases, entertainment at the touch of a button. But they might also be bewildered by our isolation, our anxiety, our endless busyness that accomplishes so little of lasting value. They might wonder why, with all our advantages, we seem no happier than they were. They might be puzzled by our abandonment of community, our loss of craft traditions, our separation from the natural rhythms that govern their lives. The medieval world we have explored was neither the romantic fantasy of chivalric literature nor the hellish darkness of popular imagination. It was a complex civilization with its own logic, its own achievements, its own wisdom. The people who inhabited it were not fundamentally different from us. They were clever and foolish, cruel and kind, ambitious and content, creative and destructive in the same measures we are today. Their world shaped ours in ways we rarely acknowledge. The universities where medieval scholars debated became our centers of learning. The legal principles hammered out in manor courts evolved into our systems of justice. The Gothic cathedrals that reached toward heaven inspired our skyscrapers that perform the same gesture in secular form. The guild systems that regulated medieval crafts transformed into our professional associations and trade unions. Even our romantic ideals, our notions of individual rights, our concepts of national identity, all have roots in medieval soil. The tension between individual and community, between tradition and innovation, between earthly and spiritual concerns that characterized medieval life continues to define our debates and struggles. As we return fully to the present moment, to the safety and comfort of your modern bedroom, carry with you some appreciation for those who came before. They faced challenges we can barely imagine with courage we might not possess. They created beauty in the midst of hardship, found joy despite suffering, and built civilizations that endured for centuries. Remember the peasant rising before dawn to work the fields, their labor feeding nations. Remember the plague survivors rebuilding their shattered world with determination that defies comprehension. Remember the craftsmen and scholars preserving and advancing knowledge against all odds. Remember the nobles, for all their flaws, trying to maintain order in a chaotic world. These were not characters in a story, but real people who loved, suffered, struggled, and died so that we might eventually live in the comfort and freedom we now enjoy. Their dreams and fears, their successes and failures, echo through the centuries to shape our present moment. Let the weight of history settle gently upon you like a warm blanket, not as a burden but as a comfort. You are the heir to all these centuries of human struggle and achievement. The blood of peasants and nobles alike flows in your veins. The knowledge they preserved and expanded fills your world. The institutions they built, modified, and improved over generations structure your society. As sleep approaches, or if you choose to return to full wakefulness, take with you this final thought. We are all temporary inhabitants of our historical moment, just as they were of theirs. Future generations will look back at us with the same mixture of admiration and bewilderment with which we view the medieval world. They will wonder at our blindnesses, marvel at our achievements, and struggle to understand how we lived as we do. The medieval world has vanished, its castles fallen to ruin, its certainties dissolved, its knowledge partially lost. But the human story continues, each generation building upon the last, carrying forward what proves valuable, discarding what no longer serves. You are part of this great continuum, connected to every peasant who ever pushed a plow, every scholar who copied a manuscript, every parent who sacrificed for their children's future. Rest now, in the comfort they could never imagine, but with appreciation for the long, difficult road that led from their world to yours. The church bells that once marked medieval hours have fallen silent, but time continues its steady passage, carrying us all forward into whatever future awaits. And so our journey through medieval times comes to its quiet close, like the settling of dust in an abandoned great hall, like the last echo of plainsong in an empty cathedral, like the slow extinguishing of a candle that has burned through the long watches of the night. Sleep well, time traveler, and dream perhaps of distant days when life was harder but possibly simpler, when the world was smaller but deeper, when humanity faced its trials with whatever courage it could muster, just as we must face ours. The past recedes, the present embraces you, and the future waits patiently for tomorrow's awakening.